you are awake, the first thing you notice is the smell. And the second thing you notice is that the mask you are wearing is supposed to prevent the smell from reaching you, and it is not working. Not entirely, because nothing about this mask works the way anyone currently believes it works.
The mask covers your entire face. It is leather, hardened and shaped, with a long curved beak projecting from where your nose would be. The design that will eventually give the entire profession its visual signature, the image that history will remember long after it forgets almost everything else about this period. Inside the beak, dried herbs, flowers, spices, sometimes a vinegar-soaked sponge. The theory, which is wrong but coherently wrong, is that disease travels through bad air, miasma, and that filling the space around your nose with strong-smelling substances will purify the air before you breathe it, or at least overpower the corrupted air with something less lethal.
In is 1348? You are somewhere in Europe. France, Italy, England. The specific country matters less than the specific catastrophe, because the catastrophe is everywhere at once. You are a plague doctor, in the robes and mask that will become, eventually, one of the most recognizable images of the medieval period. The long waxed leather coat, the wide-brimmed hat, the gloves, the wooden cane.
Let's be honest about what you actually are, because the title doctor is doing a lot of work it cannot support.
The plague doctors of the 14th century were, in most documented cases, not the trained physicians of the medieval medical establishment. Those physicians, understandably, often fled the worst affected areas, since their training gave them no actual tools against the disease, and their social position gave them the means to leave. The role of plague doctor was frequently filled by second-tier practitioners, sometimes barber surgeons, sometimes men with minimal formal training who were recruited, often by city governments desperate to project some appearance of medical response, specifically because no one with better options wanted the job.
Your function in practical terms is threefold. You visit the sick and the dead and record what you find. A form of bureaucratic plague management, the towns needing to know who has died and roughly when and in what numbers, for tax purposes, for inheritance purposes, for the basic administrative continuity that even a collapsing civilization tries to maintain. You attempt treatments that will not work, because doing nothing is unacceptable to dying people and their families, even when nothing effective is available. And you provide, simply by being visibly present in your distinctive costume, the appearance that the authorities are responding to the crisis, which matters for civic order even when the response itself accomplishes nothing medically.
You are, in the bleakest possible sense, a public relations function wearing a beaked mask.
The town you're walking through this morning is, by any standard you have encountered in your life before this, devastated. The Black Death, what contemporaries called the Great Mortality, the Great Pestilence, simply the death, arrived in Europe in 1347, carried by ships from the Black Sea trading ports, where it had already devastated populations along the routes the Mongol Empire had connected a century earlier. The disease, transmitted primarily by fleas living on black rats, but capable in some forms of spreading directly between humans through respiratory transmission, moved through Europe with a speed and lethality that no civilization on the continent had any framework for understanding.
By the time you are walking through this town in 1348, the plague has been present for months. The mortality rate among those infected with the bubonic form, the most common form, marked by swollen, blackened lymph nodes called buboes, typically in the groin, armpit, or neck, was somewhere between 30 and 60%. The pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs directly and could spread person to person through coughing, was almost universally fatal, often within a day or two of the first symptoms. The septicemic form, in which the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, could kill within hours, before the characteristic buboes even had time to form.
The town's bell has not stopped ringing in weeks. Not for services, for deaths. Every death in a medieval town was traditionally marked by the church bell, a specific number of tolls, depending on the status and age of the deceased. A public announcement that let the community know who had died and could begin the proper mourning rituals. In normal times, this was a meaningful, occasional sound. In 1348, in this town, the bell rings so continuously that it has stopped functioning as an announcement and has become simply the ambient sound of the disaster. Like wind, like rain. Present, constant, eventually, almost unheard, because it never stops.
Your first stop this morning is a house at the edge of the town, where a family has reported deaths.
The protocol. To the extent that any consistent protocol existed in this period of overwhelmed, improvised civic response, requires you to examine the bodies, note the visible symptoms, estimate the time of death, and record the names for the parish register. You knock on the door. No one answers, because there is no one left in the house capable of answering.
You enter.
What you find, and what plague doctors across Europe found in thousands of houses across this terrible year, is a family that died in stages. The earliest deaths perhaps a week before the latest, the survivors caring for the dying as long as they were able before succumbing themselves. The progression is visible in the room. Someone tried to keep the space orderly at first, and the disorder increases as you trace the chronology backward to the most recent collapse. The smell is the smell that the herbs in your mask cannot fully block.
You count the bodies. You note what you can. You leave the house and mark it. A cross painted on the door in some towns, or simply a report to the authorities that this house should be avoided. Its contents potentially handled with care or burned outright, depending on local policy.
This is your work. This will be your work for the rest of this week and the rest of this terrible year, and though you do not know this, for several more years after that, because the Black Death will recur in waves through the early 1350s before settling into the recurring but less catastrophic pattern that will periodically devastate European populations for the next 300 years.
Let's talk about your protective equipment, because it deserves more attention than its reputation suggests.
The full plague doctor costume. Beaked mask, wide-brimmed hat, waxed leather coat, leather breeches, gloves, boots, the wooden cane used to examine patients and lift their clothing without direct contact, is often credited to a French physician named Charles Delorme, who is said to have designed it around 1619, considerably after the period you are in. The miasma theory underlying the costume's design was, however, already current in 1348 and would remain the dominant explanatory framework for disease transmission for centuries, so the protective logic, block the bad air, avoid direct touch, was already operating in cruder forms in your own equipment.
You wear thick robes that you have personally treated with wax or tallow, creating a smooth, somewhat impermeable surface that you have heard. Correctly, though for reasons no one in 1348 understands, makes it harder for fleas to attach to and bite through your clothing. You do not know this is why it works, if it works at all in your particular version. You believe it is because the smooth surface resists the miasma. The accidental correctness of medieval protective practices, getting the right answer for entirely the wrong reasons, is one of the strange recurring features of pre-germ theory medicine.
The cane allows you to examine patients, lift bedclothes, and probe buboes without direct skin contact, which is again accidentally useful against a flea-borne disease, though you believe its purpose is to avoid touching corrupted flesh and absorbing the miasma through your own skin.
Let's talk about how the disease actually traveled. In terms that no one in 1348 understands, but that are worth knowing as you walk through this devastation.
Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague, lives naturally in populations of wild rodents across Central Asia, in a stable, low-level relationship that does not typically produce mass mortality events in its natural reservoir hosts. The bacterium spreads through fleas that feed on infected rodents and then bite other animals or humans. Under most circumstances, this remains a localized, manageable phenomenon, contained within wild rodent populations far from human settlement.
What turned this into a continent-spanning catastrophe was trade. The Mongol Empire's trade networks, the same Silk Road infrastructure that carried paper and silk and Buddhist texts in more peaceful centuries, also carried, in 1347, infected fleas on the black rats that traveled as stowaways on merchant ships and caravans. The Genoese trading post of Kaffa, on the Black Sea, came under siege by Mongol forces in 1347, and the besieging army, decimated by the plague, is said to have catapulted infected corpses over the walls in one of history's earliest documented attempts at biological warfare, though the disease had likely already spread through the rat and flea populations regardless of this gesture.
Genoese ships fleeing Kaffa carried the plague to Sicily by October 1347. From there, it spread along the Mediterranean trade routes with terrifying speed. Genoa and Venice by January 1348, Marseille and other French ports soon after. And from these maritime gateways, inland along the river valleys and trade roads that connected every part of Europe to every other part. The same infrastructure that had made medieval Europe increasingly prosperous and interconnected. The expanding trade networks, the growing cities, the commercial relationships that linked the Mediterranean to northern Europe, became the precise mechanism of the catastrophe's spread.
You are walking this morning through one node in a transmission network that connects this town, however small and however far from the sea, to a trading post on the Black Sea, to the steppes of Central Asia, to wild rodent populations that have carried this bacterium for longer than human civilization has existed. None of this is visible to you. All of it is true.
Let's talk about Avignon, because the papal court itself was not spared, and the response of the church's most senior officials tells you something about how even the most powerful institutions of medieval Europe were forced to improvise in the face of a catastrophe their entire intellectual framework had no real tools for.
Pope Clement VI resided in Avignon during this period, the papacy having relocated from Rome decades earlier in a separate and complicated political history, and his physician, Guy de Chauliac, who would go on to write one of the most important surgical texts of the medieval period, left a detailed account of the plague's effects on the city. De Chauliac described two distinct forms of the disease he observed, one marked by continuous fever and the spitting of blood, killing within 3 days, and another marked by the buboes and abscesses you have already encountered, with patients surviving somewhat longer, typically 5 days before death. This distinction, made by careful clinical observation centuries before the bacteriology that would explain it, corresponds reasonably well to what modern medicine would later identify as the pneumonic and bubonic forms of plague.
Da Chauliac himself contracted the disease and survived, one of the relatively fortunate few among the medical practitioners who attended the sick throughout this period. He wrote, with a frankness that is striking given his position, that the plague made a mockery of medicine, that physicians were ashamed to be unable to offer any help, and that they avoided visiting the sick for fear of becoming infected themselves. And when they did visit, they dared not approach. This admission, from one of the most respected physicians of his era, writing for an audience of other physicians, is a remarkable document of professional humility, forced by circumstances that no amount of training could overcome.
The Pope himself, according to several accounts, sat between two large fires for extended periods during the worst of the epidemic, following the miasma theory's logic that intense heat might purify the air around him and prevent infection from reaching his body. Whether this offered any actual protection is doubtful by modern understanding, but it illustrates how completely the prevailing disease theory shaped behavior even at the absolute highest levels of medieval society. The Pope of the Catholic Church, the most powerful religious authority in Western Christendom, sat by fires because the available science of his era suggested this might help, and no one available to him knew enough to suggest anything more effective.
Let's talk about your own daily routine in more detail, because the practical logistics of being a plague doctor in a town like this one involved more than the dramatic mask and robes suggest.
Your day typically begins before dawn, while the air is coolest and, according to the miasma theory you operate under, least corrupted by the heat-driven release of pestilential vapors from rotting matter and standing water. You visit the houses that have reported deaths or new illness overnight, working through a list compiled by whatever civic official remains functioning in this position. Often a role that has itself seen rapid turnover, as the men who held it before you have, in many cases, died or fled.
At each house, your examination follows a rough pattern, even without formal standardized protocol. You observe the patient from as much distance as your cane and your professional courage allow, noting the presence and location of buboes, the color and texture of any skin lesions, the patient's breathing and evident level of consciousness. And you ask whatever questions the patient or their family can still answer about when symptoms began and how they have progressed. You record this information when you are literate enough to do so yourself, or dictate it to an assistant who travels with you for exactly this purpose, since the documentation of plague deaths has become, in this crisis, one of the few administrative functions that civic authorities are still attempting to maintain with any consistency.
Between houses, you walk through streets that have changed character entirely from what they were before the plague's arrival. Marketplaces that would normally bustle with commerce stand largely empty, their stalls shuttered, the merchants who once worked them dead, fled, or too frightened to conduct business in a public space that contact with strangers might render lethal. The relative silence is itself a kind of evidence, an auditory record of a population that has been reduced and is operating. Those who remain under conditions of fear that suppress all but the most essential movement and interaction.
Let's talk about the economic disruption that the plague produced even in this earliest, most acute phase, because the catastrophe was not merely medical. It tore through every structure of daily commercial and social life simultaneously.
Trade between towns slowed dramatically as travelers avoided areas known to be affected, and as the labor required to produce and transport goods became unavailable due to death, illness, or the simple unwillingness of healthy people to expose themselves to the risk that travel and commerce now represented. Agricultural production suffered as farmers died in the fields or abandoned their work to flee or to care for sick family members, leaving crops unharvested in a pattern that would, in many regions, produce genuine famine conditions in the years immediately following the worst of the plague's first wave, compounding mortality through starvation on top of the disease itself.
Prices for basic goods, where they could be obtained at all, often rose dramatically, reflecting both genuine scarcity and the opportunistic price gouging that crisis conditions reliably produce among those merchants and suppliers who remained healthy enough to continue operating. Wages, paradoxically, would eventually rise substantially in the plague's aftermath due to the severe reduction in available labor, a development we will return to in the final section of this account.
But in the immediate crisis you are currently experiencing, the dominant economic reality is simply disruption, scarcity, and the genuine difficulty of maintaining the basic functions of a market economy when so many of its participants are dead, dying, or too afraid to leave their homes.
Let's talk about the specific composition of the dried herbs and substances you carry inside your mask's beak, because the precise mixture, while medically ineffective by modern understanding, reveals the sophisticated, if misguided, pharmacological thinking that underlay even this most superstitious-seeming element of your protective costume.
Common ingredients in plague mask preparations across various regions, and over the following centuries included dried roses or other strongly scented flowers, camphor, mint, cloves, myrrh, and storax, a fragrant resin derived from certain trees. The theoretical logic was consistent with humoral and miasma theory. Strong, pleasant smells were believed capable of overpowering or neutralizing the corrupted air believed responsible for disease transmission, while certain substances were additionally credited with directly purifying or strengthening the air passing through them before it reached your lungs.
You replace this mixture periodically when its scent begins to fade, obtaining fresh herbs and aromatics from whatever apothecary or herb seller remains operating in this town. A profession that has, if anything, seen increased demand during this crisis, since everyone from the wealthy fleeing citizens to the desperate poor who cannot flee seeks whatever protective substances and remedies the apothecary's trade can offer, regardless of how limited their actual efficacy proves to be against the disease actually moving through the population.
The apothecary you visit for fresh supplies is, like you, attempting to maintain some semblance of normal commercial and professional function amid circumstances that have disrupted every other aspect of ordinary town life. He sells you the herbs without much conversation. Conversation itself has become a kind of luxury that fear and exhaustion have stripped from many interactions in this period, replaced by the minimum necessary exchange required to complete essential transactions before both parties retreat again into whatever protective isolation they can manage.
Let's talk about the specific experience of fear itself, because the psychological dimension of living through this catastrophe deserves attention beyond the practical and medical details we have already covered.
You have, by this point in your work as a plague doctor, developed something that might be called professional emotional management, though the medieval period had no such clinical vocabulary for what you are doing. The constant proximity to death, to suffering, to grieving families and dying patients requires some psychological mechanism for continuing to function, for getting up each morning and walking into the next house where you expect with grim and consistent accuracy to find more death and more suffering.
Some plague doctors and gravediggers and others whose work required this constant exposure reportedly developed a kind of hardened detachment, a professional distance from individual tragedy that allowed them to continue functioning, but that observers sometimes found unsettling in its apparent coldness. Others maintained, throughout their work, a continued capacity for grief and horror at each new case, a sensitivity that made the work itself more psychologically costly, but that perhaps preserved something of their fuller humanity, even as it made each day more difficult to bear.
You do not know, examining your own reactions during this week of work, which pattern better describes your own psychological adaptation to this catastrophe. Some mornings, you feel almost nothing as you approach another house marked for plague visitation, a kind of merciful numbness that lets you do what needs doing. Other mornings, particularly when the house contains children, or when you recognize a face from before the crisis began, the horror breaks through whatever protective distance you have managed to construct, and you find yourself, despite the mask that hides your expression from the people you serve, fighting to maintain the composed professional demeanor that your role requires.
Good night. For now.
Second day. You are meeting with the town's senior physician, one of the few formally trained doctors who has not fled, to discuss the latest theories about what is causing the mortality. This conversation, repeated in various forms in towns across Europe throughout 1348, is one of the most important things to understand about this period. Not what was actually happening, which no one in this room will ever know, but what they believed was happening, and how reasonable those beliefs seemed given everything available to medieval European intellectual culture.
The dominant medical theory of disease in 1348 was humoral theory, inherited from Galen and the broader Greco-Roman medical tradition that had been transmitted through the Islamic world and back into Europe over the preceding centuries. The same tradition we encountered in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, now 500 years downstream, and adapted into the European medical curriculum. The theory held that the body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that health depended on these humors remaining in proper balance. Disease was an imbalance caused by various factors including diet, climate, and the quality of the air.
Miasma theory, the idea that disease was carried by bad air, corrupted by rotting organic matter, swamps, or astrological influences, fit naturally within this framework. If you breathed in bad air, your humors would be thrown out of balance and disease would result. This explained why diseases seemed to cluster in certain locations, places with bad air, like swamps or crowded, poorly ventilated cities, and why certain protective measures, strong smells, fires, avoiding foul-smelling places, seemed to offer some protection. It was wrong about the mechanism. It was not entirely wrong about some of the correlations, since poor sanitation, crowding, and certain environmental conditions did genuinely correlate with disease transmission, just not through the mechanism the theory proposed.
The astrological explanation was, in 1348, taken with complete seriousness by the most educated minds in Europe.
The medical faculty of the University of Paris, asked by the King of France to investigate the cause of the plague, produced a report in October 1348 that attributed the disaster to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius that had occurred in 1345. This was not a fringe theory. This was the considered judgment of the most prestigious medical institution in Europe, presented to the king as authoritative scientific analysis. The conjunction, the report explained, had caused the air and the seas to become corrupted, releasing poisonous vapors that traveled across the world, causing the mortality.
The religious explanation existed alongside the medical and astrological ones, often held by the same people simultaneously, without apparent contradiction. The plague was God's punishment for human sin, a divine chastisement for the corruption and moral failures of Christian society. This explanation produced some of the most extreme behavioral responses to the crisis. The flagellant movements, in which groups of penitents traveled from town to town, whipping themselves in public ritual, hoping that visible suffering and atonement would turn aside God's wrath. The flagellants grew so numerous and so disruptive, and were associated with violence against Jewish communities, who were scapegoated as a cause of the plague in some of the worst anti-Semitic violence in medieval European history, that Pope Clement VI eventually condemned the movement in 1349.
The physician you are speaking with takes all of these theories seriously, weighing them against each other, trying to determine which combination of factors best explains what he is observing in his patients. He is not stupid. He is operating with the best available framework of his civilization, applying it carefully and rationally to evidence that framework cannot actually explain.
This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is one of the most important things history can teach. Intelligence and rationality, applied within an incorrect framework, can produce confident, carefully reasoned conclusions that are completely wrong. The physician in front of you is not failing through stupidity or carelessness.
He is failing because the germ theory of disease will not exist for another 500 years, and without it, no amount of careful observation can identify the actual mechanism. A bacterium called Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily through the bite of fleas that have fed on infected rats, occasionally transmitted directly between humans through respiratory droplets in the pneumonic form of the disease.
He asks you about your own observations from your rounds. You cannot tell him anything useful, partly because you don't speak any language he would understand, but more fundamentally, because even if you could communicate perfectly, explaining bacterial transmission and flea vectors to a 14th century physician would require explaining microscopy, cell biology, and germ theory first, an education that would take years, that has no foundation to build on in this intellectual context, and that he has no reason to believe over the authoritative theories he already holds.
You are sitting across from a careful, intelligent man, and you cannot tell him the one thing that would actually help him, because the gap between your knowledge and his framework is too large to cross in a conversation, even if the conversation were possible.
Let's talk about what treatments were actually attempted, because the gap between theory and desperate practice produced some of the strangest medical interventions in history.
Bloodletting. Opening a vein to release what was believed to be corrupted or excessive blood was a standard treatment for almost any ailment in medieval medicine, and the plague was no exception. Patients already weakened by the disease were frequently bled, a treatment that almost certainly worsened their condition and accelerated death, though this was invisible to physicians working within humoral theory, where removing excess or corrupted humors was expected to help regardless of the patient's overall physical state.
Lancing the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes, was attempted by some physicians, sometimes with genuine therapeutic logic, draining the infected material, and sometimes purely as an attempt to relieve the patient's pain. This occasionally helped by accident, since draining an abscess can sometimes provide real relief, regardless of the underlying disease theory, but it also exposed the physician performing the procedure to direct contact with infectious material, and many physicians and surgeons who attempted this died from their own treatments.
Theriac, a complex compound medicine containing dozens of ingredients, sometimes including viper flesh, that had been used since antiquity as a general antidote to poison, was administered in large quantities, on the theory that the plague was essentially a form of poisoning by corrupted air, and an antidote to poison might counteract it. It did not work, but the belief in its efficacy was sincere and widespread.
Prayer, pilgrimage, the wearing of specific religious medallions, and the burning of specific herbs believed to purify the air rounded out the treatment landscape. None of it worked. All of it was attempted with sincere hope by people who had no other options, and no way of knowing that no other options existed within their available knowledge.
Let's talk about the Jewish communities, because the religious explanation for the plague produced some of the most documented and most horrifying violence of this entire catastrophe.
In numerous towns across Europe, particularly in the German-speaking lands and parts of France and Spain, Jewish communities were accused of having caused the plague by poisoning wells, a conspiracy theory with no basis in fact that spread with the same terrifying speed as the disease itself. The accusation drew on pre-existing anti-Semitic prejudices that had simmered in medieval European society for centuries, finding in the unprecedented catastrophe of the plague an opportunity for organized violence.
Pogroms, organized massacres of Jewish communities, occurred in dozens of towns throughout 1348 and 1349. In Strasbourg, in Basel, and numerous towns along the Rhine, Jewish populations were rounded up and killed, sometimes burned alive in large groups. The violence often officially sanctioned or at minimum permitted by local authorities who either believed the conspiracy theories themselves or found it politically useful to allow the violence to proceed.
Pope Clement VI issued formal condemnations of this violence, pointing out, with the kind of basic logical observation that should not have needed to be stated but clearly did. That Jewish communities were dying from the plague at the same rates as everyone else, which made the well poisoning theory transparently absurd. His condemnation had limited practical effect in stopping the violence, which continued in various forms throughout the crisis.
The plague did not create anti-Semitism in medieval Europe. It already existed, deeply rooted in centuries of religious and economic tension. But the catastrophic scale of the mortality, combined with the absence of any rational explanation that medieval intellectual frameworks could provide, created conditions in which existing prejudices could explode into mass violence with a speed and scale that peacetime conditions had not permitted. This is a pattern that recurs across history. Catastrophic uncertainty creates demand for explanation, and minority groups, already viewed with suspicion, become convenient targets for that demand, regardless of their actual relationship to the catastrophe's cause.
Let's talk about the role of religious processions and public penance, because alongside the more extreme flagellant movements we have already discussed, ordinary parish-level religious responses to the plague reveal how communities tried, through collective ritual, to address a catastrophe that exceeded every individual's capacity to manage alone.
Local processions calling for divine mercy were organized in towns across Europe throughout this period, typically involving the carrying of relics or sacred images through the streets, accompanied by prayers and hymns specifically composed or selected for their relevance to plague and pestilence. These processions represented in their organized, sanctioned form exactly the kind of communal response that the more extreme and theologically unauthorized flagellant movements had taken to disturbing extremes. The same underlying impulse toward collective religious action in the face of incomprehensible suffering, channeled through institutionally approved, rather than independently organized practice.
Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch emerged during this period as particular objects of devotion specifically associated with plague protection, their cults growing dramatically in the decades following the Black Death's first wave as communities sought saints whose intercession might offer protection against a recurring threat that showed no sign of permanently disappearing. Saint Sebastian's traditional iconography, pierced by arrows yet surviving, provided a visual metaphor readily adapted to plague protection, the arrows reinterpreted as symbols of disease striking the body. Saint Roch, according to his hagiography, had himself suffered from plague and recovered, making him a particularly direct object of appeal for those currently afflicted or fearing affliction.
Votive offerings. Promises made to saints or to God in exchange for protection or recovery, often involving commitments to future pilgrimage, charitable donation, or specific religious observance. Multiplied during this crisis as individuals and entire communities sought whatever spiritual leverage might supplement or substitute for the medical interventions that had proven so consistently ineffective. Towns that survived the plague with comparatively lower mortality than their neighbors sometimes attributed this fortune to the efficacy of specific local saints or relics, contributing to the uneven but widespread growth of particular regional religious devotions throughout the decades following the initial catastrophe.
Let's talk about how plague doctors like yourself were actually compensated and regarded by the communities they served, because the social position of this role was considerably more complicated and more precarious than the visually striking costume might suggest.
Kuvic contracts for plague doctors, where formal arrangements existed, typically specified payment from municipal funds, sometimes supplemented by fees charged to wealthier patients who could afford to pay for visits beyond the baseline service the contract guaranteed. These arrangements varied enormously between different towns and regions, reflecting the considerable improvisation that characterized civic responses to a crisis without precedent or established administrative protocol. Some towns offered substantial payments specifically because the role's danger made recruitment difficult.
who would willingly expose themselves daily to a lethal, poorly understood disease, regardless of compensation, unless desperation or unusual courage made the risk acceptable.
The social regard in which plague doctors were held was similarly mixed. On one hand, you perform a function the community genuinely needs. Someone must visit the sick, must document the dead, must provide whatever minimal medical attention remains possible. On the other hand, your constant proximity to disease, your distinctive and frankly unsettling costume, and the simple psychological association between your presence and the deaths you document mean that you are frequently regarded with a mixture of necessary gratitude and instinctive dread. Children in particular, according to surviving accounts from across plague-affected Europe, often found the beaked mask genuinely terrifying, and the figure of the plague doctor would persist long after the immediate crisis, as a kind of folk memory bogeyman in regions that had experienced repeated plague visitations.
Some individuals who took on this role were, frankly, opportunists. Men with little to lose and some willingness to gamble their own survival against the payment and social position the role might offer, including, in some documented cases, formerly disreputable or marginal figures who found in the plague crisis an unexpected path to civic employment and modest respectability that their previous circumstances had denied them. Others were driven by genuine, if theologically and medically misguided, conviction that they were performing necessary and even holy work, bearing witness to suffering that someone needed to address regardless of personal risk.
Let's talk about the Jewish persecutions in more practical detail, because we touched on this earlier, but the mechanics of how these accusations spread and what protections, if any, existed for targeted communities deserve fuller treatment given how directly they illustrate the human capacity for catastrophic scapegoating under conditions of unbearable uncertainty.
The well-poisoning accusations against Jewish communities typically originated through some combination of torture, extracted confessions, Jewish individuals arrested and subjected to interrogation methods that reliably produced whatever confession the interrogators sought, regardless of actual guilt. And the simple, terrible logic of communities desperate for an explanation that placed the catastrophe's cause within human and therefore potentially controllable hands, rather than accepting the more frightening possibility that the disease simply moved according to natural or divine processes entirely beyond human influence or comprehension.
Once such accusations took hold in a particular region, they spread with disturbing speed through exactly the same communication networks. Traveling merchants, religious correspondence, simple rumor passed between travelers. That should, in principle, have also spread Pope Clement's explicit condemnation of the theory and his clear statement that Jewish communities were dying from the plague at comparable rates to everyone else. The persistence of the persecution, despite this papal condemnation, reveals something important about how conspiracy theories and scapegoating violence, once they acquire sufficient social momentum, can become remarkably resistant to even the most authoritative correction from the highest religious authority of the era.
Some local rulers and civic authorities did attempt to protect Jewish communities under their jurisdiction, recognizing both the injustice of the accusations and, in some cases, the practical economic value that Jewish commercial and financial activity provided to their territories. The degree of protection offered varied enormously, however, and many Jewish communities, faced with the choice between fleeing to uncertain safety elsewhere or remaining in increasingly hostile circumstances, chose displacement, contributing to demographic shifts in European Jewish settlement patterns that would persist for generations. With populations moving away from regions of particularly severe persecution toward areas, often in Eastern Europe, where local authorities offered more reliable protection or where the persecution had been less severe.
Let's talk about astrology in more depth, because the University of Paris report we discussed represents only the most prestigious example of an explanatory framework that pervaded medieval intellectual culture far more broadly than that single document suggests.
Astrological medicine. The belief that planetary positions and movements directly influenced human health and disease susceptibility was not a fringe or superstitious practice in 14th century Europe, but an integrated component of formal medical education and practice, taught at the same universities that trained physicians in humoral theory and Galenic medicine, treated as a legitimate diagnostic and prognostic tool rather than as something separate from or opposed to scientific medical practice as later periods would understand that distinction.
Physicians trained in this tradition would consult astrological charts not merely for general explanations of why a plague might be occurring, but for specific guidance about individual patient treatment, determining favorable times for bloodletting or other interventions based on lunar phases and planetary positions. A practice that persisted in various forms in European medical practice for centuries after the period you are currently experiencing. The conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars that the University of Paris report identified as the plague's ultimate cause was understood within this framework not as superstition, but as the application of established astrological medical principles to an unprecedented and catastrophic case.
This intellectual context matters because it helps explain why the actual cause of the plague, a bacterium transmitted by fleas living on rats, remains so completely outside the range of explanations that even the most educated minds of this era could conceive. The conceptual tools available to 14th century European intellectual culture, however sophisticated within their own internal logic, simply had no framework for the kind of microscopic biological causation that modern germ theory would eventually establish. The physicians and scholars who consulted astrological charts and humoral theory were not failing through laziness or stupidity. They were reasoning carefully and rigorously within the only conceptual framework available to them. A framework that happened to be fundamentally incorrect about the actual mechanisms of infectious disease.
Good night.
Third day. You have traveled to a larger town, summoned by a more urgent request. The local authorities are overwhelmed and have asked for additional plague doctors from the surrounding region, a coordination effort that, however inadequate, represents one of the more organized civic responses to the catastrophe that medieval Europe managed to produce.
What you find, walking through the streets, is a city that has been hollowed out.
Let's talk about the actual mortality figures. Because the scale of the Black Death is difficult to hold in the mind, even when you are standing inside it.
Modern historical demographers estimate that the Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, a range that reflects genuine scholarly uncertainty about a catastrophe that occurred before reliable census taking. But even the low end of that range represents a mortality event with no comparable precedent in recorded European history. Some cities and regions were hit harder than others. Florence, one of the best documented cases due to the detailed chronicle left by Giovanni Boccaccio, may have lost more than half its population. Some isolated rural areas were spared almost entirely due to simple geographic luck in avoiding the trade routes along which the disease traveled.
The speed of the mortality is as significant as the scale. This was not a slow demographic decline spread across generations. Most of this death occurred within a span of about 4 years. A person could be born into a world of a certain population and density and social structure, live through their 20s, and find themselves, by their 30s, in a fundamentally different world. Fewer people, abandoned villages, a labor market transformed, social structures that had seemed permanent revealed as suddenly negotiable.
You walk past a row of houses, several of them marked with the signs that indicate the household has been entirely lost to the plague. No survivors, the property reverting to whatever inheritance or feudal claim applies in the absence of an heir.
The economic consequences of this mortality, though you will not live to see most of them fully develop, are among the most significant in European history. The dramatic reduction in the labor force fundamentally altered the balance of power between laborers and landowners that had structured European feudal society for centuries. With fewer workers available, the surviving laborers could demand higher wages and better conditions, a shift in bargaining power that the existing feudal and manorial systems were not designed to accommodate. Landowners attempted to resist this shift through legal mechanisms like England's Statute of Labourers in 1351, which tried to fix wages at pre-plague levels by law. These efforts largely failed against the basic economic reality of severe labor scarcity, and the slow erosion of the feudal system that the labor shortage initiated would contribute, over the following century, to its eventual collapse across much of Western Europe.
You do not know any of this yet. Walking through the empty streets in 1348, you are simply doing your rounds, counting the dead, in a catastrophe whose full consequences will not be visible for generations.
The social fabric strains visibly under this pressure.
Some communities responded with extraordinary mutual support. Neighbors caring for the sick at risk to themselves. Religious orders that continued their charitable work, even as their own numbers were devastated by exposure to the sick they served. Boccaccio, in the introduction to his Decameron, written in the years immediately following the plague's worst impact on Florence, describes both the heights of charitable behavior and the depths of abandonment, sometimes in the same family, sometimes in the same individual at different moments of the crisis.
He describes parents abandoning sick children, a reversal of the most basic instinct of human parental care, driven by terror of contagion so severe that it overrode bonds that had seemed unbreakable. He describes, simultaneously, servants who remained loyal to dying masters when family members had fled, risking and sometimes losing their own lives for loyalty to people who, in normal circumstances, might never have reciprocated such devotion.
The plague revealed, as catastrophic events do, the full range of human response, the worst and the best, often in close proximity, often in ways that defied the social hierarchies that had seemed natural before the crisis. A peasant who showed extraordinary courage caring for the sick might demonstrate more genuine virtue, by any reasonable measure, than the wealthy merchant who fled at the first sign of infection and abandoned his own household. The plague did not respect social rank in who it killed, and it did not respect social rank in revealing who behaved well and who behaved badly under the pressure of mass death.
You encounter a group of gravediggers, one of the few occupations that has, grimly, expanded rather than contracted during this period, though it too suffers from severe attrition as workers exposed to the dead frequently sicken and die themselves.
Mass graves, plague pits, have become a standard feature of urban management during this crisis. The traditional burial practices of medieval Christianity, with their elaborate rituals and individual graves and extended periods of mourning observance, simply could not function at this scale. Bodies needed to be removed quickly, both for basic sanitation and because of the correct, though for wrong reasons, belief that contact with the dead spread the disease further. Churches and civic authorities authorized mass burial in pits, sometimes lined with lime, the bodies placed in layers, with as much dignity as circumstances permitted, but with a speed and scale that abandoned almost every traditional element of the medieval Christian funeral.
The gravediggers you are watching work with the grim efficiency of men who have done this every day for months, and have, in some psychological sense, had to set aside the normal human response to mass death in order to continue functioning. They do not speak much. The work does not require conversation, and perhaps conversation would make the work harder to bear. Let's talk about quarantine, because the word itself comes from this period,
even though the practice you are observing is still relatively crude compared to what it will become.
The Italian maritime republics, Venice in particular, which we will walk through in more detail another time, developed some of the earliest systematic quarantine practices in response to the plague. Ships arriving from infected areas were required to wait at anchor, isolated from the port, for a period before their crew and cargo could come ashore. The standard period eventually settled at 40 days. 40 giorni in Italian, the origin of the word quarantine. Though the scientific basis for this specific duration was more a matter of practical and religious convenience. 40 being a numerologically significant period in Christian tradition, echoing the 40 days of Lent and the 40 days Christ spent in the wilderness, than any precise epidemiological calculation of the disease's incubation period.
This practice, crude as it was, represented one of the first systematic public health interventions in European history that produced genuine results, even though its theoretical justification, preventing the entry of corrupted air or miasma, was incorrect. By isolating ships and their potentially infected rat populations from port cities for an extended period, the quarantine practice accidentally interrupted the actual transmission chain, the fleas and rats that carried the bacterium, even though no one understood that this was the actual mechanism at work.
You will not see quarantine practiced with this level of systematic organization in the town you are currently in. That level of civic infrastructure exists primarily in the wealthy maritime city, states with sufficient administrative capacity to enforce it. But the concept is beginning to spread, town by town, as desperate civic authorities experiment with anything that seems to offer even a chance of slowing the catastrophe.
Let's talk about what happened to the family structures that survived this period in fragmentary form. Because the demographic disruption you are witnessing in this town reorganized the fundamental units of medieval society in ways that took generations to fully resolve.
Orphan children, whose parents had died while they themselves survived. A pattern that occurred with some frequency, given that mortality varied somewhat by age and individual immune response, though no group was truly safe, presented a particular challenge to communities already struggling to manage their own survival. Extended family networks, where they survived intact, generally absorbed these children according to existing kinship obligations, but in cases where entire extended families had been devastated, religious institutions, and increasingly as the crisis wore on, ad hoc community arrangements had to manage children who had no surviving relative capable of providing for them.
Widows and widowers faced their own complicated reorganization of social and economic position. A widow with property inherited from a deceased husband might find herself, for the first time, in direct control of land or commercial assets that custom and law had previously routed through male family members, creating, in the aftermath of this catastrophe, instances of female economic authority that would have been unusual before the crisis disrupted so many of the male lives that had previously held this authority. Remarriage rates spiked substantially in many affected communities in the years immediately following the worst mortality, driven by both genuine personal and economic necessity, and by the simple demographic reality that available marriage partners had been redistributed by death in ways that created new opportunities and pressures for those who survived.
The inheritance disputes that emerged from this period of rapid, unplanned mortality were extensive and, in many documented cases, genuinely difficult to resolve through existing legal frameworks that had never anticipated death occurring at this scale and this speed. Multiple potential heirs to a single property might die within days of each other, creating genuine uncertainty about which death had occurred first, and therefore which line of succession should apply, a problem so common that several medieval legal systems developed specific doctrines and presumptions in the plague's aftermath to address exactly this kind of simultaneous or near-simultaneous mortality among related claimants to an estate.
Let's talk about the specific geography of how the plague moved through a town like this one.
because understanding the spatial pattern of infection, even though you, like everyone else in 1348, cannot correctly identify its mechanism, reveals something important about urban structure and vulnerability.
Densely populated neighborhoods, particularly those housing the urban poor and crowded, often substandard housing, generally experienced higher mortality rates than wealthier districts where larger properties allowed greater physical separation between households and, crucially, between the rat populations whose fleas actually transmitted the disease, though no one in this period understands this causal chain. Religious institutions, monasteries, convents, and the communities of clergy and lay brothers and sisters who lived in close communal proximity while also maintaining extensive contact with the sick through their charitable obligations, frequently suffered catastrophic mortality rates, sometimes losing the overwhelming majority of their resident population within a matter of weeks, a pattern that reflects both their communal living arrangements and their religiously motivated continued exposure to plague victims, even as other social groups increasingly avoided such contact.
Port towns and major trade route junctions, naturally, experienced the disease's arrival earlier, and often with greater initial severity than more isolated inland communities, reflecting the simple mechanics of how the plague actually spread, through ships, through trade caravans, through the movement of infected rats and fleas along the same commercial networks that had made medieval Europe increasingly prosperous and interconnected in the decades before this catastrophe arrived to exploit exactly that interconnection.
You have noticed, in your own rounds through this town, that certain streets and certain neighborhoods seem to suffer more severely and more rapidly than others, though you, like every other observer in this century, lack the conceptual framework to correctly explain why. You attribute it, when you attribute it to anything beyond simple divine will, to differences in air quality, to proximity to swamps or refuse heaps that might generate corrupting vapors, to the astrological influences that affect different parts of a town unequally, according to theories of geographic astrological correspondence that medieval intellectual culture took entirely seriously. The actual explanation: population density, proximity to grain stores that attracted rats, the specific living conditions that either facilitated or impeded flea transmission between rodents and humans, remains genuinely invisible to you, hidden behind a correct observation of pattern that you can only explain through an incorrect theoretical framework.
Let's talk about how the surviving population coped psychologically with the sheer scale of bereavement they experienced. Because the mourning practices of pre-plague medieval Europe were simply not designed for the kind of mass, simultaneous, overwhelming loss that this catastrophe produced.
Traditional medieval Christian mourning involved elaborate, ritually prescribed observances, specific periods of formal mourning, masses said for the soul of the deceased, the wearing of particular clothing signaling bereaved status, and a whole structured social process through which a community acknowledged and processed the death of one of its members. This entire system depended on a death rate low enough that any given death could receive this kind of individualized attention and observance. The plague's mortality rate made this traditional mourning structure simply impossible to maintain at anything like its normal form.
Surviving accounts from across plague-affected Europe describe a kind of mourning exhaustion, or mourning numbness, setting in among populations that had lost so many family members and community members in such rapid succession that the normal emotional and ritual processing of each individual death became practically and psychologically unsustainable. Boccaccio's account of Florence describes people becoming almost indifferent to death by the crisis's peak, no longer weeping or performing traditional mourning rituals for losses that in ordinary times would have produced extended and visible grief, simply because the sheer continuous repetition of loss had overwhelmed the community's emotional and ritual capacity to process it through traditional means.
This is not callousness in any simple sense. It is closer to a kind of protective psychological adaptation, the human mind and the social structures built around it, reaching the limits of what they can process through normal channels, and finding, in the absence of better alternatives, a kind of numbed continuation as the only available response to catastrophe on this scale. Modern psychological understanding of trauma and grief, developed centuries after this period, would recognize patterns in these medieval accounts that align with what contemporary clinicians understand about how human beings respond to overwhelming, repeated loss, not as evidence of medieval people being somehow less emotionally sophisticated than later populations, but as evidence that human psychological responses to mass catastrophe follow patterns that transcend the specific historical period in which they occur.
Let's talk about the specific role of women in this crisis beyond what we have already discussed, because the gendered dimensions of plague response and plague mortality deserve more direct attention.
Women frequently served as the primary caregivers for sick family members, a role consistent with broader medieval gender expectations around domestic care, but one that placed them at disproportionate risk of infection through the close physical contact that nursing the sick required. Mothers caring for infected children, wives caring for infected husbands, daughters caring for infected parents. These caregiving relationships, while reflecting genuine love and felt obligation, also meant that women bore a particular burden of exposure risk that contributed to plague mortality patterns in ways that are difficult to fully quantify from the surviving historical record, but that multiple contemporary accounts specifically note.
Midwives and other women with specialized caregiving knowledge found themselves, during this crisis, called upon for medical assistance well beyond their normal professional scope, since the formal medical establishment of trained physicians proved so completely inadequate to the scale of need that informal caregivers, including women whose knowledge came through traditional practice and experience rather than university training, became essential providers of whatever comfort and care remained possible for the sick and dying.
Religious women. Nuns and members of various female religious orders dedicated to charitable work frequently continued their care for the sick and dying, even as mortality among their own communities climbed to catastrophic levels, a pattern of continued service despite personal risk that multiple contemporary chroniclers specifically praised as exemplary religious devotion, even as the same chroniclers sometimes simultaneously criticized the general population's tendency towards self-preservation and abandonment of sick family members under the same circumstances.
Good night.
This is the last night.
We have spent a week inside the worst year of the worst pandemic in recorded European history, and before we leave it, we need to look forward to what this catastrophe actually changed, because the changes were enormous, and because understanding them tells you something important about how civilizations respond to and recover from catastrophic shocks.
The Black Death did not end in 1351, though the worst of the first wave subsided by then. The disease would return repeatedly over the following centuries. Major outbreaks in the 1360s, in the 1370s, and periodically thereafter, with the disease becoming endemic in parts of Europe, flaring up in localized epidemics for the next 300 years. The Great Plague of London in 1665, more than 3 centuries after your visit, was a late and well-documented recurrence of the same disease, now better understood in its symptoms even though the actual cause, the bacterium, the flea vector, the role of rats, would not be identified until Alexandre Yersin's research in 1894 in Hong Kong during yet another global plague pandemic.
You will not live to see germ theory. No one you know will. The actual mechanism of the disease that has devastated your world will remain unknown for over 5 centuries after this week, and the medical and scientific tools required to understand it, the microscope, cellular biology, bacteriology, will need to be developed from nothing,
building slowly across generations of accumulated knowledge that this catastrophe, paradoxically, will help motivate.
Let's talk about what the Black Death changed in European society, because the changes reach into almost every dimension of life.
The labor shortage transformed the economic relationship between workers and landowners, as we discussed, but it also transformed agriculture itself. With fewer farmers available to work the land, many marginal agricultural lands were abandoned entirely, reverting to pasture or wilderness. Sheep farming, which required less labor than grain cultivation, expanded significantly in England and elsewhere, contributing to the wool trade that would become a major economic engine for centuries.
The reduction in population also meant, for those who survived, a generally improved standard of living in the decades immediately following the plague. More land available per surviving person, higher wages for labor, more social mobility than the rigid pre-plague feudal structure had permitted. This is one of the genuinely strange features of catastrophic mortality events in pre-modern economies. The survivors, on average, often experienced improved material conditions, because the basic economic constraint of land and resources, scarce relative to population, had been violently resolved by mass death.
The religious and intellectual consequences were equally profound, though harder to quantify. The Church's inability to provide effective protection or explanation for the catastrophe damaged its authority in ways that would contribute, over the following 2 centuries, to the intellectual and religious ferment that eventually produced the Protestant Reformation. If God's representatives on earth could not protect the faithful from this catastrophe, if priests died from the plague at the same rates as everyone else despite their sacred office, the absolute authority of the medieval church's claims about its special relationship with the divine became, for many surviving Europeans, genuinely open to question in a way it had not been before.
Art and culture changed too.
The art that emerged in the decades after the Black Death shows a marked preoccupation with mortality and the macabre that had not been as prominent before. The dance of pauper, the dance of death, became a popular artistic motif. Skeletal figures leading the living of every social rank, from kings to peasants, in a single inevitable procession toward the grave, a visual reminder that death respected no hierarchy. This was not morbid indulgence. It was a culture trying to process a trauma so enormous that ordinary modes of artistic and religious expression could not adequately contain it.
Some historians argue that the psychological and cultural impact of the Black Death contributed to the conditions that eventually produced the Renaissance, that the radical demographic and economic disruption, combined with the intellectual questioning that the plague's defeat of established medical and religious authority provoked, created space for new ways of thinking about humanity, mortality, and the natural world that the rigid structures of the high medieval period had not easily accommodated. This is a contested claim, and the causation is almost certainly more complicated than a simple line from plague to Renaissance. But the timing is suggestive, and the scale of disruption was, undeniably, enormous enough to change the trajectory of an entire civilization.
Let's talk about the artistic and literary tradition that emerged not just in the immediate aftermath, but across the following century and a half, because the Black Death's psychological impact on European culture extended far beyond the practical economic and social changes we have already discussed.
The genre of memento mori art, visual and literary works specifically designed to remind the viewer or reader of the inevitability and unpredictability of death, flourished in the decades following the plague's first devastating wave, building on existing medieval Christian traditions of contemplating mortality, but intensifying this preoccupation with an urgency that the recent overwhelming experience of mass death had made viscerally immediate rather than merely theological and abstract. Funerary art increasingly depicted decomposing corpses alongside the living, transy tombs showing a deceased person's body in active decay
beneath a more conventional commemorative effigy above, a visual juxtaposition that forced viewers to confront the physical reality of death's transformation of the body in terms that earlier medieval funerary art had generally avoided or minimized.
Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in England in the latter decades of the 14th century, several decades after the events you are currently experiencing, would create in the Canterbury Tales a literary monument to exactly the kind of diverse, socially mixed company of travelers that the plague's disruption of established social hierarchies had made newly visible and newly interesting as a subject for serious literary attention. The Pardoner's Tale, specifically, tells the story of three young men who, while drinking in a tavern, learn that a friend has died from a plague-like affliction, and who set out to find and kill death itself, only to discover, through a complicated chain of betrayal and greed, that they have in fact found their own deaths through their own actions. This tale, composed within living cultural memory of the Black Death's devastation, uses the disease as a structural premise for exploring greed, mortality, and the futility of trying to outrun or defeat death through any human stratagem.
The broader European literary tradition continued producing plague-related works for centuries, as recurring outbreaks kept the disease and its social and psychological consequences continuously relevant to successive generations of writers, artists, and ordinary people who had no reason to believe, well into the 17th century and beyond, that the threat had permanently receded. Daniel Defoe's account of the Great Plague of London in 1665, written decades after the actual events it describes, drew on this long tradition of plague literature while documenting a specific, well-recorded outbreak that demonstrated how persistent the disease's threat remained across more than 3 centuries, following the events you have personally witnessed this week.
Let's talk, finally, about the demographic recovery, because the population losses you have witnessed this week, while catastrophic in their immediate impact, did not represent a permanent ceiling on European population growth.
Europe's population, reduced by somewhere between a third and a half by the plague's first wave and the recurring outbreaks of the following decades, would not return to its pre-plague levels for well over a century in most regions, and in some particularly hard-hit areas, recovery took considerably longer still. This extended period of demographic stagnation and gradual recovery had complex effects on European society that extended well beyond simple population numbers. Agricultural land that had been marginal before the plague, requiring intensive labor to remain productive, was frequently abandoned permanently in favor of less labor-intensive uses like pasture, contributing to long-term changes in European land use patterns that persisted long after population numbers had recovered.
The genetic and immunological consequences of the plague's selective mortality have been the subject of considerable modern scientific research, with some studies suggesting that surviving populations may have carried genetic variations that provided some resistance to the specific pathogen responsible, variations that could have been selected for through the simple brutal mechanism of differential survival during repeated plague waves across the following centuries. This research remains an active area of scientific investigation, but it suggests that the plague's impact extended even into the genetic composition of the populations that survived and eventually recovered their numbers.
You will not see any of this recovery, of course. Your week in this devastated town ends here, in the midst of the crisis, with the bells still ringing for the dead, and the grave diggers still working their grim, continuous labor. But the civilization you are walking through, however broken, and however overwhelmed by a catastrophe it cannot understand or effectively treat, will eventually rebuild. Not by forgetting what happened here, but by carrying the memory of it forward into new social arrangements, new artistic traditions, New questions about authority and mortality, and the proper relationship between human beings and a natural world that had just demonstrated, with horrifying clarity, how little control any human institution actually held over the most fundamental terms of life and death.
You have been here 1 week. You have walked through houses where entire families died in stages, the survivors caring for the dying until they too succumbed. You have sat with a physician who applied careful, rational thought to an incorrect framework and arrived at confident, wrong conclusions through no fault of his intelligence. You have watched mass graves being dug with grim efficiency by men who have stopped being able to process the individual tragedy of each body and have had to retreat into pure function simply to continue their work. You have seen the worst of human behavior: abandonment, scapegoating, violence against minority communities, blamed for a catastrophe they did not cause. You have seen the best: loyalty maintained at fatal personal cost, charitable orders continuing their work even as it killed them, communities that organized themselves to bury the dead and care for the dying with whatever resources remained.
The mask you wear did very little to protect you, for reasons no one in this century will understand. The cane you carry kept you slightly further from direct contagion than you would otherwise have been, for reasons no one in this century will understand either. You walked through one of the worst catastrophes in human history, wearing a costume designed around an incorrect theory, doing a job whose primary function was bureaucratic and psychological rather than medical. And you did it anyway, because someone had to, and because the alternative, doing nothing, recording nothing, providing no presence at all in towns that were otherwise entirely alone with their dead, was somehow worse.
The bird that has been singing outside continues, indifferent to the catastrophe, the way birds always are, the way the natural world generally is to human disaster. The sun is beginning to rise over a Europe that will eventually recover, that will rebuild its population over the following century, that will undergo the religious and artistic and economic transformations that this catastrophe set in motion, that will, centuries from now, develop the actual scientific understanding that would have let you do something more useful than counting the dead in a leather mask that didn't work the way you believed it worked.
You take off the mask, finally, at the end of your rounds. The morning air, unfiltered by herbs and vinegar, is just air. It always was. Let's talk about the long-term institutional and legal changes that the plague's labor disruption produced, because the economic consequences we touched on earlier extended into formal legal and political structures that reshaped European society for centuries.
England's Statute of Laborers, which we mentioned briefly, attempted to legally fix wages and labor mobility at pre-plague levels, reflecting landowning elites' anxiety about losing their accustomed economic advantage as surviving laborers found themselves, for the first time in generations, in a position to demand better compensation and conditions given the severe scarcity of available workers. This kind of legislative attempt to suppress market forces through direct legal prohibition proved, across England and similar attempts in other affected regions, largely ineffective at actually preventing wage increases, since the basic economic reality of labor scarcity created pressures that legal prohibition could slow, but not ultimately reverse.
The social tensions this created between landowning elites attempting to maintain traditional economic relationships and a laboring population newly aware of its enhanced bargaining position contributed to several major social uprisings in the decades following the plague's worst mortality, most notably the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which, while triggered immediately by specific taxation grievances, drew much of its underlying energy from exactly this broader tension
between traditional feudal economic expectations and the changed economic reality that mass mortality had produced. Wat Tyler's rebellion and similar uprisings elsewhere in Europe represented, in this sense, a delayed but direct social consequence of the demographic catastrophe you have personally witnessed this week.
The eventual, gradual transition away from traditional feudal labor obligations toward more flexible wage labor arrangements, a transformation that historians generally describe as proceeding over the following several centuries rather than occurring as any single decisive break, nonetheless found one of its most significant initial catalysts in exactly the kind of labor scarcity and shifted bargaining power that the plague's mortality produced. The medieval economic and social order that had structured European life for centuries did not collapse overnight because of the plague, but the plague initiated structural pressures that, accumulating across subsequent generations, contributed substantially to its eventual, gradual transformation into the considerably different economic arrangements that would characterize early modern Europe.
One final thing before this week ends.
You have spent these days documenting death, applying treatments you suspected even at the time were unlikely to help, and bearing witness to a catastrophe that exceeded every available framework your civilization possessed for understanding or managing it. The mask you wear, the herbs you carry, the bloodletting and theriac you sometimes administer despite mounting evidence of their ineffectiveness. None of it constitutes the actual medical response that a later understanding of bacteriology and epidemiology would eventually make possible. But the act of bearing witness itself, the simple continued presence of someone willing to walk into houses full of the dying and the dead, to count and record and attempt whatever comfort remained possible, represents something that should not be dismissed simply because the medical theory underlying it proved incorrect.
Future generations, equipped with antibiotics that can treat plague effectively when caught early, with an understanding of vector-borne disease transmission that allows for genuinely effective public health intervention, with all the accumulated scientific knowledge that 5 centuries of continued inquiry would eventually produce, will look back on this moment with the particular clarity that hindsight provides. But the people living through it, you, the physician you consulted, the gravediggers, the families caring for their dying, the entire devastated population of this town, and the thousands of towns like it across Europe, were doing the best they could with what they had, which was, in the end, mostly courage and persistence in the face of something that defeated every other tool available to them.
That is not nothing. It may, in fact, be most of what any civilization can offer in the face of a catastrophe that exceeds its understanding. Not correct answers, but the continued willingness to show up, to try, to bear witness, and to keep going until enough time has passed and enough has been learned that better answers eventually become possible.
Good night. Good night.